preparations are underway. We expect to see the president shortly.
For what he called an historic and honorable compromise.
By the early 1990s, Netanyahu's hardline politics were out of fashion. The talk was no longer of war, but of peace. Negotiations were underway with their Arab neighbors.
It's a day for optimism.
And now with the Palestinians.
In secret by the principals, by the PLO and the Israelis.
Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, a former general and hero of the '67 war, represented Israel. Representing the Palestinians, Yasser Arafat, the chairman of the PLO.
This is a historic breakthrough. Between Israel and the PLO, two national movements competing for the same space, and for the first time they're prepared to recognize each other.
Known as the Oslo Accord, it was designed to end years of violence by laying out a peace process, a deal that could give Palestinians their own state and land captured in the '67 war.
Once the agreement was done, it was the White House as the venue agreed for the signature. President Clinton felt this was his baby.
But that day, things were tense.
To the last minute, there were issues. Rabin is insisting that Arafat can't come in anything that looks like a uniform. We're telling Arafat, you can't come with you don't bring a weapon. He's always had a pistol. You don't bring a weapon to the White House.
Then at a point, the president looks at Rabin and he says, "You're going to have to shake his hand." And Rabin looked like someone had punched him in the stomach. And he stood there for a moment. This is a man he considered a terrorist all his life. And he said to Clinton, "Okay, but no kissing." So we then went down to the Oval Office, and we worked out of how if Arafat liked to kiss, usually 3 kisses, and we worked out sort of football, basketball movers of how Clinton could step in various ways. If Arafat made a lunge toward Rabin, how Clinton could break them up.
Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Arafat, Yitzhak Rabin, the President of the United States.
The ceremony was carefully scripted. There were speeches, the signing of the Oslo Accord, and all eyes were on Arafat and Rabin.
Rabin is very uneasy. The idea of personally shaking hands with this guy is physically difficult for him. He couldn't hide his feelings, and that comes through.
The first agreement ever signed between
And then the handshake.
and the State of Israel.
An image that would become iconic.
These hands that shook knew nothing but to shoot. The trigger, the bullets, the bombs, the fight. And the question to me is, can this handshake lead to the culture in the minds of Palestinians and Israelis that coexistence is possible, that peace is possible, to live and let live?
Now, in Israel, Netanyahu was building a coalition of the ultra-religious right and security-minded conservatives. They strongly opposed the Oslo Agreement. And in no time, protests began.
The world celebrated that handshake, that historic handshake, on the White House lawn. But in Israel, there was a fair degree of skepticism.
Week after week, Netanyahu watched the protests build.
The people on the right in Israel were not happy about the Oslo process. And recognizing the PLO terrorists was a bitter pill.
We're demonstrating against the inability of the government to maintain order in this country and to protect the rights of Jews living in their own land.
With an election on the horizon, Netanyahu maneuvered the growing anger into a political force.
He did not believe in the possibility of a deal with the Palestinians. He didn't trust them. He didn't like them. He doesn't. and he doesn't want to have a deal with them. He didn't want to have a deal with them.
As head of the conservative Likud party, Netanyahu himself became the face of the opposition to Oslo.
Netanyahu saw a moment of betrayal and peril and an agreement that would never and could never work.
There's a really ugly character to it. The level of vitriol, the anger, the scope of these demonstrations, the kind of incitement, the portrayal of Rabin, dressing Rabin in Nazi uniforms or putting a keffiyeh on him.
Netanyahu found himself at the center of the anger.
In most cases, he doesn't do anything about it. I think Netanyahu, even in some ways, benefits from this association with the rabble-rousers on the right.
I think the country's political system was superheated. It was like a car riding on a highway that had no water left in the radiator. And you could look at the temperature gauge, and it's all the way in hot.
The intensity grew, culminating in a massive protest. Tens of thousands crammed into the center of Jerusalem.
He was genuinely outraged, but he knew how to channel that outrage, and that coincided with his rise to power.
In Netanyahu's conservative Likud party, there was concern about the growing tension in the crowds that night.
There were moments when Netanyahu was advised that, there are real nutcases in the national religious camp that we see that we need to calm down, even gesturally. Netanyahu never did that. He never did that, to his enormous discredit.
The crowd was with him as he attacked Arafat. And then the government of Yitzhak Rabin.
אני אומר כאן לממשלת ישראל שמתרפסת בפני האיש הזה. אני אומר לה בשם הציבור הגדול הזה. אנחנו כאן כי לעולם לא ניתן לחלק מחדש את ירושלים.
All Likud leaders, especially Benjamin Netanyahu, they have used very strong language against Prime Minister Rabin.
אנחנו פה כי יש לנו רק ירושלים אחת ונשמור עליה.
They didn't use any kind of condemnation against the violence that was starting to take place.
Netanyahu would later say he never saw the ugliest moments that night. Throughout Israel, the anger boiled over.
I was there, and a lot of other people my age were there. This was such a volatile atmosphere at the time, and the writing was on the wall.
Night after night, the crowds massed across the street from Prime Minister Rabin's apartment in Tel Aviv.
I'm there one Shabbat evening. We're talking. It's just the two of us. And there's a demonstration outside. And I said to him at the time, I said, don't you worry about some of this? He goes, no. I mean, it's not that he was, it's not that he was completely dismissive of it, but he took it as kind of a given. He knew, in a sense, what was coming and simply accepted it.
Rabin responded with his own rally. More than 100,000 supporters singing of peace. Then, as Rabin was leaving, that's him coming down the ramp. The man in the blue t-shirt approached. 3 shots from behind.
The Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, the architect of the Middle East peace process, has been assassinated.
The assassin, a right-wing Israeli Jew, Yigal Amir.
Truly shocking news from the Middle East tonight. Israel's Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin has been assassinated.
Evening spent dreaming of peace turns into a national nightmare.
Outside the hospital, the crowd began to chant, "Bibi is a murderer." The sign says, "Bibi, Rabin's blood is on your hands."
An assassin has taken yet another world leader away from us. It was just after the biggest peace rally in Tel Aviv.
Rabin's widow blamed Netanyahu for contributing to her husband's death.
Yitzhak Rabin has also produced shock in the Palestinian community.
And said so on worldwide television.
Your husband pointed the finger at Mr. Netanyahu and said, "You must stop this incitement."
Yeah.
To what extent do you blame Mr. Netanyahu and the Likud for what has happened?
I do blame them. In a rally in Kikar Zion in Jerusalem that showed him in the uniform of a Nazi. So Mr. Bibi Netanyahu, now he can say from here to eternity that he didn't support it and didn't agree with it, but he was there and he didn't stop it.
As the nation mourned, Bibi Netanyahu talked about the political costs of Rabin's death.
Netanyahu sat next to me, and I remember Netanyahu saying to me, look at this. He's a hero now.
And Netanyahu had a new and powerful opponent, the American president.
President Clinton was really affected by Rabin's assassination, and he viewed, I think, Netanyahu through the eyes of Rabin as the person who would bring down Oslo if given half a chance.
Your prime minister was a martyr for peace, but he was a victim of hate. Surely we must learn from his martyrdom that if people cannot let go of the hatred of their enemies, they risk sowing the seeds of hatred among themselves.